urban education, equity, and improvement at Tulane University. Further, Dr. Whitaker also holds the distinction of being an appointed scholar of practice in residence at Defense University. Additionally, Dr. Whitaker is a Board of Trustees member for Tacoma Academy Charter School, former Pennsylvania Department of Education, equity expert, and a recommended speaker for American Program Bureau. Dr. Whitaker completed his doctoral degree in educational leadership at Tufts University. He also earned a master's degree in education at the University of Pennsylvania, a master's degree in business administration at Eastern University, and 2 undergraduate degrees from Geneva College, where he graduated magna cum laude. Additionally, Dr. Whitaker earned a certificate in culturally sustaining teaching from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and a certificate of diversity and inclusion from Cornell University. As a researcher and scholar, Dr. Whitaker publishes articles that focuses on the psychology of race and racism, issues related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogy, and the societal and educational disenfranchisement of African American males. His scholarship has been included in books and handbooks such as The Ultimate Guide for Teachers to Multicultural Literature, The Beauty and the Burden of Being a Black Professor, The Handbook on Promoting Social Justice in Education, Culturally Responsive Teaching and Teaching in Higher Education, Social Justice and Education and Putting Theory into Practice in Schools and Communities, the Handbook of Research on Black Males, and then another handbook, the Handbook of Urban School Leadership. And that was a mouthful, right?
Yes, it was.
Busy, very busy man.
Yeah.
Dr. Whitaker presents his research at both national and international scholarly conferences and within K-12 educational settings. He is revered amongst colleagues for engaging in tough conversations in a respectful manner. Dr. Whitaker was a 2018 Delta Epsilon Sigma faculty inductee, a 2017 Black Theology Fellow at Princeton Theological Seminary, a 2016 American Educational Research Association, the Asa Hilliard and Barbara Sizemore Fellow, a 2014 Phi Kappa Phi inductee, and a 2012-2014 University Council for Educational Administration. Dr. Whitaker is the author of the forthcoming book titled Put Some Respect on My Name, The Fierce Urgency of Culturally Reverent Pedagogy for Black Males. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, the gentleman that I'm about to bring forward is steeped in experience. So please give it up for Dr. Ronald W. Whitaker II.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Appreciate you.
Absolutely.
All right. And while you are celebrating me, hopefully you can do a better job of celebrating your esteemed bacillus, Dr. Darrell Blackwell. Come on, y'all. Let's give it up for Dr. Blackwell. Also, can we recognize the soon-to-be Dr. Julian Graham, who is the chair for this week's Achievement Week. Also, our honoree, who we will hear from really shortly, Dr. Womack. We celebrate you and also honor you. And everyone in this room, honestly, it is an honor to be here with you tonight on such an auspicious occasion. but also a critically important conversation that we need to have. So I'm very clear on a couple things. After you eat, you don't keep people too long, right? Because some things are going to set in. But there is a twofold mandate that I believe that I'm supposed to give to everyone that's in this room tonight, everyone that possibly is online, and that is both a celebration of this great fraternity, but also a charge that aligns with why today and why this week is critically important. So I just want to kind of just lift up a couple thoughts from the theme, the triple A's of achievement, right? The triple A's of achievement. I kind of want to walk through this framework that really illuminates what this gathering is all about. But let me take us back. On May the 21st, 1971, the late, great Marvin Gaye released his critically acclaimed album, which was titled What's Going On? And if anyone is familiar with history, here's what you understand about that album. Motown didn't want to release it. They didn't want to release the album because you have to think about this. In the mid 60s and the late 60s, Marvin Gaye was this sex symbol. Marvin Gaye was this star on Motown Records. He was known for making love songs. He was known for having these great ballads. And Barry was saying, we don't do that political stuff over here. We don't make political records. We don't make protest records. You need to stick to the script. You need to stick to the script and just sing these love songs. But Marvin, he's at a place in his life where we all have been at one time or another. And if you have never been there, trust me, you're going to get there. Marvin was dealing with some personal challenges. His money was funny. He was going through a bad breakup, which ended in a divorce. But then also Marvin, Dr. Womack, catch this, he was cognizant of everything that was happening from a global perspective. Marvin is saying, how am I going to keep on making these love songs when we got brothers that are over in Vietnam that are getting killed, but once they come back, they are still treated as second-rate citizens? I got to ask the question, what's going on? So Marvin said, well, you know what? If you don't want to release it, it's cool, because I won't release another album for you. Now, ultimately, Barry Gordy said, okay, cool. You have your way. Release the album. And a couple years ago, Rolling Stones magazine, they did a list of the 500 most influential albums of all time. Number one on that list was the song, not just the song, but the album, which is titled Marvin Gaye's What's Going On from Marvin Gaye. So that situates some of the arguments, again, that I want to raise tonight, where we have to existentially wrestle with that question, what's going on? So when I talk about the triple A's, the first A that I need to bring up is the need for us to be accountable, right? The need for us to be accountable to what this week is all about, what your fraternity is all about, what us as Black men, what we should be about. Now, Dr. Blackwell, you probably know this, but we are in the city of Philadelphia, which, as reports would suggest, out of the 10 largest U.S. cities, Philadelphia has the highest poverty rate. So the 10 largest U.S. cities, Philadelphia is number one when it comes to poverty. So obviously, that shouldn't surprise us when we think about the intersections. What goes with that? Violence. When we look at what's going on with our school system. And this is why we have to be accountable to what this week is all about and what your fraternity is all about. But not only that, when we think about what's happening here in Philadelphia, it's also a depiction, a sad depiction of what a lot of economists are predicting. So what they're predicting is that by 2053, which is right down the street from us, the Black median household wealth will be zero. Y'all just catch what I'm saying? It will be zero. But then when we think about also what's going on, we have these so-called academic achievement gaps, which is nothing more than opportunity gaps. We have healthcare gaps. We have wealth gaps. We got gaps in terms of life expectancy. But at the core, catch this, Julian, and hopefully you're citing Dr. Eddie Glaude. Dr. Eddie Glaude, he makes this argument that the reason that we have all of these gaps is because we're dealing with America's original sin. And here's what Dr. Glaude would argue. He argues that America's original sin is not racism, but it's the value gap, right? He argues it's the value that we put on white bodies in comparison to everyone else. And he said, until we deal with the value gap, we're going to keep on having every other gap that exists. And he suggests this in his follow-up book, where he says the reason that these gaps persist is because America keeps lying. Did y'all just hear what I'm saying? He said America keeps on lying, where they're suggesting that, you know what? Racism doesn't exist. Y'all hear that? Where they're suggesting that, you know what? Everyone has the same opportunities. And for those of us that work in the education fields or sociology fields or other fields that we're on the ground, we realize that it's sad that even in 2023, an individual zip code determines what resources they will get. So when we think about this first A about accountability, it reminds me of Ubuntu. That I am because we are. And because we are, I am. And we got to understand that, you know what? We got to be accountable to one another. When I'm thinking about Julian Graham, your brother Julian Graham, the reason why I'm on him to do a dissertation is not so we can walk across the stage. That's going to happen. But we need his research to matter in real life. Because I don't know about you, but black and brown bodies are still catching hell. Black and brown bodies are still dealing with what Du Bois would argue in his book, Souls of Black Folk in 1903, that we are still viewed as problems in society. Dr. Mark Lamont Hill, who is a professor here at Temple University, what he suggests is that people are viewing us as nobodies. This is why we have to be accountable to one another. But then the second A I want to give us is the importance of having the right attitude. Here's what my grandma would say, Dr. Womack, she would say, we got to get rid of this stinking thinking. We got to get rid of thinking too low. Now, when I did my research about the history of Omega Psi Phi, what I found out is that in the 60s, Malcolm X was invited to Morgan State University to have a debate. And they said that they had to turn people away because folk wanted to hear Malcolm X. Because people didn't want to hear pomp and circumstance. They wanted to hear the truth. And they said that Malcolm was going to give them the truth. Well, here's the truth if we're going to study Malcolm X. And I hope that everybody in this room, at least one time in your life, you have read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Here's what Malcolm X would ask us tonight. Who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate yourself? That when you look in the mirror, you feel as though you're less than somebody. Who taught you to hate yourself? That when you walk in rooms, you feel as though you don't belong there. That we're dealing with an imposter syndrome. Who taught you to hate yourself as if the programs and the initiatives that we launched, that they're substandard? That's what Malcolm X would ask all of us tonight. That, you know what, we got to rise up. We have to have a better attitude. But then I heard Dr. Blackwell lift up one of my heroes, Carter G. Woodson. And Dr. Woodson, he raises this book in his, this claim, I should say, in his influential book, The Miseducation of the Negro. He said, if you can control a man's thinking, you ain't never got to worry about that person's actions. Y'all just hear what I said? That's what he said in 1933. He said, all I got to do is just control your thinking. And I never have to worry about what comes next. Carter G. Woodson said this, if it's not a backdoor because of the lies that have been given to us, we will go make a backdoor. What am I saying when I'm talking about attitude? What I'm suggesting, Julian, is that Far too often we settle for less because we believe that's all that we should have. And if it's not us, it's our brothers, it's our cousins, it's our family members on the outside. That you got a lot of young brothers walking up and down Broad Street tonight with tattooed tears, which is nothing more than a symbol of pain, a symbol that they are less than. You got a lot of young sisters don't understand their value and their worth. They think that if I don't twerk on TikTok, then I'm not worth anything. And this is why this is not about a conversation. This is about a commitment to be accountable to one another, to go deeper on the programs, go deeper on the initiatives, go deeper on the great mandates of this fraternity. But then when we think about, even from a symbolism standpoint, and intersecting that with the importance of having the right attitude, catch this. Do y'all even realize what your colors represent? When you put the purple on, that represents what? Royalty. When you put the gold on, that represents value. The message that we need to give to not just young brothers, but young sisters, to communities, is that we are a royal people. As much as I appreciate 1619, I don't mean to hurt anybody. Our history didn't start at 1619. There's a history before 1619. And when you go before 1619, you cannot talk about anything without talking about the contributions of individuals of African descent. You cannot talk about history. You cannot talk about medicine. You cannot talk about science. You cannot talk about business. You cannot talk about architecture. Even for those that want to talk about religion and Christianity, you can't even talk about Christianity without talking about individuals of African descent. We are royal folk. We are folk with value, and that's the message that we need to give. But then there's something else when we talk about the triple A's. Number one, it was accountability. We got to be accountable to one another. But then number two, it's an attitude where we got to change the way that we're thinking. We got to get back to what this week is all about, getting in our history, being motivated, being celebrated in terms of listening to the narratives of our ancestors and our elders that came before us. But then when we think about the last A, it's about altitude, where we got to go higher. But let me close with this story. April the 3rd, 1968 is a very important date in the history, not just of African Americans, but in history, period. April the 3rd, 1968 was the day that Dr. Martin Luther King gave his last speech, which is known as the Mountaintop Address. And Dr. King gave that speech in Memphis, Tennessee. And before he gave that speech, he had a rough day because he started out his morning, he was in Atlanta, Georgia. And then before getting to Memphis, Tennessee, his flight was delayed. His flight was delayed because they said Dr. King is on the flight and we can't go yet because we're thinking it may be a bomb on this plane. So the flight was delayed about an hour and a half. They finally get in the air and Dr. King lands in Memphis, Tennessee. And he says, I'm just going to chill at the Lorraine Motel because nobody wants to come hear me talk tonight. And he said, nobody's going to come out because it was a storm in Memphis, Tennessee. It was a bad storm. And he said, no one is going to come to the Mason Temple to hear me speak. So Dr. King, he's chilling in the Lorraine Motel. And then he gets a call from his closest friend, Dr. Ralph Abernathy. And Dr. Abernathy called Dr. King and said, Doc, we need you over here at the Mason Temple because it's 2,000 folk that's in here tonight, and they want to hear you speak. And Dr. King said, okay, he gets on his clothes and he goes to the Lorraine Motel, and he gives them 45 minutes of excellence, where he's talking about the best of who we are. He's talking about his own life's journey, the ups, the downs, the good days, the bad days. And Dr. King says this, that even though it was a storm, sometimes we need storms in life because it's only in the darkness that you can see the light. So here's what I want to give us, brothers, as I'm concluding with my remarks. We are living in times where there are a whole lot of storms. When we think of everything that's going on, the Supreme Court decision that banned race intermissions, that's a storm. When we think about books being banned all across America, that is a storm. When we think about individuals afraid to go out to certain places in certain communities because they don't think that they will be accepted in those communities because of racial profiling and hostile policing, that is a storm. When we think about what's going on in the city of Philadelphia, the city of Wilmington, Delaware, Baltimore, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Memphis, Tennessee, I could go on and on. Those are a whole lot of storms. But catch this. Whenever you are dealing with storms on a plane, here's what I realized. And this just happened to me a few months ago. The pilot said, I need y'all to put on your seatbelt because we're going through a storm cloud. And he said it's going to get rocky. And he said it's going to be a little bit turbulent. And it's going to be for a few minutes. But the next thing you know, after all of the rocking and getting through the storms, we started to go up higher. And the higher we went, guess what? We didn't see the storms anymore. We saw the sun. We saw the light. So what I'm arguing as I conclude is that we got to go higher, y'all. We got to go higher. And guess what? This fraternity knows something about a storm. Because as history would tell us, on November the 17th, 1911, that's when your fraternity was founded. And as history would suggest, it was a storm that night in Washington, D.C. It was a bad storm that night. But yet, the brother said, forget about the storm. We got work to do. So I just want to tell y'all, go a little bit higher on the great mandates of this fraternity. Go a little bit higher on your cardinal principles of manhood and scholarship and perseverance and uplift. Go higher on your motto of friendship being essential to the soul. Go higher on what this week is all about. Go higher on programs and initiatives, because in doing that, that's when we're truly giving honor to what this week is all about. Thank y'all.